Okay, so when we talk about Neo-Freudian, Neo means new, Freudian. So these are newer perspectives on Freud's ideas. So these are all people who were somehow influenced by psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic thought. But there's something new about their approach. There is a change. There's something different. There's something that they disagreed, let's say, with Freud about, which made them distinct. So if we were to look at it, Neo-Freudians accept some of the basic concepts that Freud said, but there are pieces of their ideas that were not part of Freud's ideas. So, for example, Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler was a student of Freud. He was in his weekly meetings, the Vienna Society. So a lot of the early psychoanalysts would meet and talk about, you know, psychoanalysis and how it applies to their patients. And Alfred Adler was there. He was part of it. And ultimately, there was a disagreement between Freud and Adler. And Adler was kicked out of this society, right? So Freud did not tolerate people like pushing back or rejecting his ideas very much. So people were routinely no longer invited to these meetings, and Adler was one of them. So you might say, well, what's the problem? Well, remember how Freud said we want to study personality and from three different parts: id, ego, superego. Well, Adler, one of the big distinctions that Adler had was he felt we should study personality as a whole, right? So he came up with this concept of individual psychology. Now, individual doesn't mean one person as opposed to group therapy in this context. It, it more or less means indivisible. You cannot divide people up into smaller parts. You cannot divide a person into just id, ego, superego. You have to study them as a composite. You have to study them as a whole. So that was a big difference of agreement, right? Difference of opinion, forgive me, between Freud and Adler. That's big. Another major contribution that Adler added to psychology was this concept of an inferiority complex. Now, as a backstory, similar to when I described Freud and his upbringing, well, it's important to understand that Adler, as a child, was always sick. He was in and out of hospitals. So he felt that we all have some organ inferiority. We all have some kind of physical issue. And how we deal with disability or impairment or inferiority as a whole will dictate how we cope. And we all have some levels of inferiority. But an inferiority complex was a more extreme sense where you feel inadequate or globally inferior to other people, right? So, he talked about strivings towards superiority, right? So let's say I'm trying to learn how to become a poet, and I'm writing my poetry, and it's really not that good. Striving for superiority would be taking something that I'm not very good at and working to become more competent at. But if you had an inferiority complex, it's hard to maintain that focus that, okay, I'm not good now, but I can become good, right? So it really hits to the core. So the person feels inadequate, inferior, uh, in a way that they can't overcompensate for. So before I go into Karen Horney, there were other things. So a discussion of birth order Adler talked about birth order as well, and somehow your position of when you were born into the family dictates your personality. Well, what did he get right? What did he get wrong? Adler got his general premise of studying the whole person right. That is a good frame of reference. He also got his understanding of inferiority complex correct. But research on birth order would suggest that it was not correct, right? There's minimal effect of birth order on personality. Now, Karen Horney. Karen Horney is an early feminist, early psychoanalyst. And story goes that her father wanted her to, you know, just stay at home and not go to school. And she wanted to go to school and further her education. Ultimately, she does. Um, Initially against her father's will, she gets a doctoral degree, and she becomes one of these individuals who are advocate for feminism and women's rights. Now, similar to Freud, she acknowledged the importance of early childhood experience and attachment, right? So these ideas of how parents treat you and raise you will affect your personality. Remember attachment? We talked about you need consistent parenting, reliable parenting. Well, if you get that, then you'll have minimal anxiety, but we do have some level of basic anxiety when we have a parent that is indifferent, unloving, and disparaging. Similar to some of the other psychoanalytic theorists, this is what she got. Her mom died early. Her dad was kind of aloof, cold, and unsupportive of her. So she was raised with this kind of sense of feeling insecure and unloved. So this idea of basic anxiety, she gets right, and we talk about basic anxiety and attachment theory. Now, as a feminist, she took offense to Freud's idea of penis envy. And she rejected the notion of penis envy. And she said, no, women don't want to be men. Women just are treated in society unfairly. So it's going to create an emotional reaction. So things like, why is it that women get paid about 80 cents on the male dollar with the same credentials doing the same job, yet they're paid less? That is a social inequity that is based in gender. And she said all those things that you think are more biological superiority, no, women's reaction in general is due to some kind of social mistreatment or unfairness relative to that. And she said, if anything, instead of penis envy, males have womb envy. And this principle is that, you know, females have the ability to create life. So somehow that is a special virtue, and men are jealous that women can produce life, to which that also is established to be false, right? If you ask the average male whether they would trade places with you, the answer is likely no, right? Uh, Childbirth is a very hard process. Prenatal development, we talked about in another lecture about all the different restrictions and all the things you have to do to avoid teratogens. It's a hard process, both prenatally and during labor and delivery. So the idea of womb envy is, while it's in reaction to penis envy that Freud said, it's not not accurate, right? So I like to teach you, but also like to talk about where the ideas come from, and also, what has been supported and what hasn't been supported by research. Now we have Erikson. We learned about Erikson in developmental psychology, right? In the psychosocial stages of development, and he had those 8 stages. Now, when we think of Erik Erikson did 2 things that, or maybe 3 things important that are different from Freud. The first thing is he's a lifespan theorist. Freud's theory ends at puberty, right? The second thing, where I said Freud kept going wrong, was his overemphasis on sex. So Erik Erikson and Erikson's daughter, they de-emphasize sex, right? So they move from a psychosexual stage theory to a psychosocial stage theory. So that's a big shift, a shift away from development and understanding stages of development. We can understand it without superimposing sex onto it. So that Erikson did. He desexualized the stages. And we also see a shift away from the id. Now, id, or Freud put a strong emphasis on the id, right? Because that's what's in the unconscious. That's where your basic drives of sex and aggression are. Well, Erikson focused more on the ego. So many people have described him as an ego psychologist. So shifting away from the id to this ego, and an understanding that the ego is somewhat independent, right? So the way we described the ego with Freud was it was a mediator. It was a mediator between the id and the superego. According to Erikson, the ego has autonomous functioning. Okay. Now we talked about those 8 stages of development. Um, they go from birth to death, right? According to Erikson, right? From trust versus mistrust, all the way to ego integrity versus despair, right? So asking yourself, did I have a meaningful, full life? So Erikson uh, really, really shifts things a lot. Another one of those people, remember I talked to you about Adler, and Adler was kicked out of the Vienna Society and then ultimately created his own society. Carl Jung was similar to Adler in that regard. Carl Jung was one of Freud's uh, favorite disciples, and he was his prize student. And then ultimately, Carl Jung started to add to his understanding, which offended Freud. And then Freud wound up kicking him out too. Now, Carl Jung had this favor in Freud's eyes because a lot of the people who were working with Freud were Jewish. And Freud was afraid that psychoanalysis would be rejected because in his era, there was tremendous anti Semitism. Well, Carl Jung was not Jewish. So he's like, I have someone who's able to bring the ideas of psychoanalysis to the world, right? And it wouldn't be viewed as this like Jewish form of therapy. Now, obviously, if you look at it, there's very little that has to do with Judaism. There are some pieces that I could connect to Judaism, but in fact, Freud was an atheist, right? So, but there was anti Semitism, and he was hoping that Carl Jung would bring his ideas further. So, okay. So, where did Carl Jung go that Freud was uncomfortable with? Well, remember how we talked about the conscious experience, the um, preconscious, and the unconscious, Carl Jung tried to explain the unconscious on another level. Carl Jung was into mysticism. He was into spirituality. And he felt that we have our personal unconscious, and our personal unconscious was very similar to what Freud said, which is our reservoir and material that we kind of push beneath the surface. It's happening in the unconscious, it's repressed, or it's forgotten, right? That's our personal lived experience that's in the unconscious. But then he added this concept called the collective unconscious. Now the collective, and Freud rejected this idea of a collective unconscious. What is a collective unconscious? This is the deepest level of our experience that is passed on and inherited through generations. So somehow we are connected to our ancestors. And there are a lot of traditions that have this understanding of a collective unconscious, right? So the idea of Mother Earth ideas, that is based on a collective unconscious. In East Asian tradition, the role of the ancestors are part of tapping into the collective unconscious. But he felt that somehow we're influenced and can tap into previous life experiences. So we have the ability to tap into not just our lived experience, but our ancestry's lived experience. So that's the collective unconscious. Okay. Now, he also introduced the concept called an archetype. Well, he's not the first person to come up with an archetype. For example, if you look at the humors, right, back in Greek and Roman mythology in those eras, they also talked about archetypes. But Carl Jung described an archetype as an inherited tendency within our collective unconscious, which makes us behave pretty similar to our ancestors. Now, we may not know why we're behaving similar to our ancestors always, but we're influenced by it. These archetypes play a role. So let's talk about the 4 primary archetypes. The persona. Now, we described personality in our first video as coming from the root of persona, right? And we describe persona as a mask. Now, when Jung describes persona, he's describing it similar to the way you might have understood it before my class. It's more of a social mask. It's the front we put on to other people. It's what we present to society on the outside, right? Now, that isn't our essence. It's part of us, but it's what we project outward. We also have masculine and feminine energy. Now, Jung believed that we all have masculine and feminine energy. Perhaps if we look at hormones, the fact that we have different ratios of testosterone and estrogen, but we all have both of these, might be some biological support for this. But what Jung said is that we have an anima and an animus. And the best way to know which one is which is look at the suffix. Anima, the last letter is A, equating to vagina, right? So this would be the more feminine side of a man. Animus, linking to penis. S and S, right? The masculine side of a woman. And we have terms that have crept into society that reflect some of this. The term metrosexual, right? Metrosexual is describing a man who's very much into their appearance or engages in activities that are stereotypically assumed to be more feminine, right? Like getting one's nails done and manicure, pedicure. It doesn't mean anything about their sexuality, right? It just means that they're in touch with more of their feminine side, and there's nothing wrong with that. Same thing with an animus. This is more of a masculine side of a woman, right? Now, what's interesting is you might have heard the term tomboy, right? And obviously, some of these terms are now socially unacceptable. But the idea of a tomboy was a rough and tumble uh, young lady, right? Who enjoyed things that were stereotypically male. So they might have enjoyed wrestling or boxing or sports or some silly things like that, right? This would be an archetype, right? Part of who we are. Now, we have the shadow. Now, if the persona is the part of us that we project outward, the shadow is the innermost or deepest recess of our personality. It's oftentimes referred to as our dark side. Now, when we talk about dark side, it does have some elements of uh, immorality, right? But it also, in the depths of our personality, that's where creativity is too, right? So when you hear the shadow, it's not always bad. And then how we unify our personality is our sense of self. That's the archetype that integrates and balances everything. So these are the four archetypes, right? Now, let's talk about our four functions. Has anyone ever taken the Myers-Briggs inventory? You might have taken it for work purposes. You might have gone on a dating app and then you're like an INTJ or whatever. People start putting up these letters as part of their personality. Well, that is rooted in Jung's work. He talks about there's this rational part and irrational part of how we operate or relate to the world. Now, rational and irrational, it's not meant to be a negative thing, right? So when we say someone has an irrational part, we're not saying they're illogical. We're just saying it doesn't need logic, right? So the rational side requires reasoning and judgment. The irrational is more of a sensory or perceptual experience. Okay, so the thinking. So a thinking part would be a person who spends a lot of time seeking and trying to understand things, developing meaning, right, around things. That's a thinking type or function. There's a feeling function. Now, here's a good example where the words, once again, are not what you think they would be. So, feeling, you might link to emotion, but here, this is more weighing the value of things, right? So, it's your experience of how important or how worth is XYZ, right? So that's your feeling. Now, then we have sensing and intuiting. This is our irrational part. This, again, it's not a negative connotation. We have our sensing, which is more of our perceptual experience or conscious perceptual experience of physical objects in our environment. And then we have intuiting, which is more of our unconscious perception, right? So we perceive subtleties, we perceive nonverbals, we perceive all kinds of things of that nature. These are our four functions. And if we put with our four functions introversion and extroversion, now we have our 8 subtypes of personality that are linked to the Myers-Briggs. I will tell you, the Myers-Briggs is very good as an instrument to predict occupational choices. But as a basic personality assessment, it's pretty poor, to be honest with you. So it's not all that great of an instrument, despite the fact that it's a very popular instrument. So this is our mini lecture on the Neo-Freudians. And I'm going to stop the recording there and move into humanistic psychology next.